Let me say good evening again.
Yes, sir.
I believe Guyana is probably the clearest case of voter padding. Guyana has a population of 750,000, and
Mm-hmm.
the voters list is 727,000 people. At the same time, the government says that it gives out cash grants to school children, and there are about 220,000 school children.
Okay, so let's pause right there so we understand what you're saying. So your population is your voter population is 750,000, you're saying?
No, the national
The
population
national
is
population.
750,000 at the last census.
Yes.
But the voters list that came out recently has on it 727,000 Guyanese. The
Mm.
school population is estimated to be 220,000 Guyanese. And if that is true, it means logically that, let's put it at 250. The maximum your voters list should be is 500,000. But
500,000. Yeah.
yeah, like I said, it is. And even that is high because the school population, there are a lot of children between 16 and 18 who are not at school, and they are not counted. So if you add those, it will be much less. But the reality of Guyana is we have a voters list that is 700,000 plus. It seems to me a mathematical impossibility.
So you basically you are about what's this, about 200, over 200,000 more than what it is supposed to be. They're
Supposed to be.
200,000, yeah, about 200. So where, in terms of this padding, where are the people coming from?
Now, the problem is this, huh? During the confusion in the last election, when the opposition, then now government, filed an action against house to house registration, which we had to stop, and the judge ruled that you cannot take people off the list. Now, we have said to the government that we are prepared as the opposition to work with you, change the legislation so we can clean the list. And we also demanded the addition of biometrics as another safeguard. The government refuses to do so, and it seems axiomatic why they would have done that. They would do that because they're the government, and it suits them to have a bloated list. And so that's the reality on the ground.
Question from Mr. Norton that people are asking if the 200,000, if they're Venezuelans.
Well, there are some Venezuelans on the list. Guyana has a law which says that if one of your parents was born in Guyana, then the children can become citizens. And so there are those who are entitled to citizenship. But there are also those who the government put in remote areas and give them ID cards so that they can vote. Now, they should not be here legitimately. Another group that the government utilizes, there's a Commonwealth rule. The rule says that if you're from a Commonwealth country and you live continuously for 1 year in Guyana, you can vote. Now, what you have in Guyana is that they have removed all the restrictions on getting a birth certificate. So a leader in a community could sign and say, you are X or Y, and you can get a birth certificate. And then they place the brother of a minister as head of the registrar. And so what happens is that a lot of people are getting birth certificate and consequently ID card because of the government's manipulation of that process. Previously, you had to go through a more strict process to confirm that you had lived in Guyana for the year continuously and that kind of thing. Now you don't have to do that. What you have is you could come from any country and you could get any leader in an Amerindian community, any community. And once that leader is favorable to the government, then they will accept the signature, and that person will get a birth certificate, and they become entitled to vote. So there's abuse of the 1 year Commonwealth rule in the society.
As you should have seen him how he was looking at you, Dr. Fontaine. I want to ask Mr. Norton, have you ever heard of this happening? What he's describing, that it happened in Dominica? Have you heard about this before?
I will add some more for Guyana. Guyana is similar and probably worse.
But before you
But
add the Guyana part, right? Did you know that this was what they were dealing with in Dominica?
yes, I follow Caribbean politics, and I've
Ah,
seen
yes.
the comments. I try to look at all the political systems in the Caribbean, and so I have an idea. I won't claim to know the details, but generally, I know throughout the Caribbean, there's a certain level of unhappiness with electoral systems. Here in Ghana, it's no different. In fact, I think it's worse. First, we have a government that instills fear. In this process, we are now in the election cycle, and you have to get signatures to support your candidates.
Mhm.
And the government is busy saying on the ground that if you sign for the opposition, then you're not likely to get contracts. If you're working with the government, your work is in trouble. So that is one. While he was speaking, I put down some others. The manipulations you talk about are here. And because Guyana is a large country geographically,
Mhm.
though we have operatives in all 10 regions, the vastness of the country constitutes a barrier when it comes to being able to scrutinize the election all across the country. And those loopholes are taken by the government of Guyana to bring people over the borders. People from Suriname come into Region 6, Corriverton area. People from Brazil come into let them in the Rupununi. And so there is that. The government has access to resources. Wealth is now playing a role in terms of
Mhm.
subjugating our system. In the last local government elections, there was open bribery of of members of the electorate. Right now, as we speak, in one of our strongholds, Linden, the government goes in and distributing contracts in a way that allows them to intimidate people and say, we're giving you $9 billion in contract, and if you don't vote for us, those contracts are in trouble. And since you're giving it close to the election, it means a lot of them will be done after the election. So that also constitutes a mechanism for instilling fear. So apart from bribery, this whole thing of instilling fear. In Guyana, it is worse because the police force is compromised. The head of the police force is a political appointee who has no shame in being political. And what you see in this period is a lot of harassment of our support base using the Guyana police force. Worst among them is the Cybercrime Act. In the local government elections, there were some manipulations. But because we are a proportional representation system, boundary manipulation won't play the role it plays in a first past the post system like yours.
Mhm.
So there is not that heavy bit of manipulation as it relates to boundaries in the national elections. But there are some other things they do that contribute. Only recently we had to say to the chief elections officer that, look, you cannot allow the governing party to put people with a tent in front of polling station. What they do is every election they will put up tents with their people in the polling station, and of course they know who are passing to vote and who didn't vote. And if they didn't, you can go and intimidate them and get them to vote. Our situation is much worse because our elections commission is compromised. The elections commission was set up in this way: three from the government, three from the opposition. And before the present elections commission chairman, Justice Claudette Singh, what the chairman did was play the role of conciliator and try to get the parties to find common ground and a consensus. She has changed that. Every decision that has been made since the 2020 election, she voted with the government. So there is no independent electoral commission anymore. GCOM, the Ghana Elections Commission, is a creature right now of the government.
So let me ask you something, because I just making sure I understand. I thought that it would be made up of, some from the government and probably 3 from the government, 2 from the opposition. I think that's how it's done in Barbados, and probably in my understanding in Dominica. There's nobody from the opposition on.
Yes, there are 3 from the opposition and 3 from government. But the decisions are made by a simple majority, and the chairman of the Elections Commission votes with the government. So every decision, regardless of how rational or irrational it is, once it comes from the government, it is voted for. And that is why we have been consistently calling on the government to let us have a new election commission chairman, one that is prepared to understand the nature of Guyana and be more of a conciliator, a finder of consensus, rather than an arbiter. She is an open, malicious arbiter. She makes no bones about it. If you know there's going to be a decision tomorrow, you can go to sleep and rest assured when you wake up tomorrow, she is going to vote with the government. They have appointed, in a very partisan way, the chief election officer, the deputy. All of them are controlled by the People's Progressive Party in government. And so Guyana has really and truly a completely authoritarian society, if one doesn't want to carry it to the ultimate to say it's a dictatorship. But it shows all the signs. You mentioned the question of ethnicity. Yes. Ethnicity plays a role in Guyana. But I do think the government's marginalization and ostracization of most people will contribute in some slight changes. But the fact is, Guyana is an ethnically divided society, and unless you are cognizant of that and manage the society in a fair way, there will be problems. There are those who argue clearly that the society discriminates in every fashion. You are there. If you go online and see the Guyana newspapers, and when they are given major contracts, not telling you when they're going in African village and give them pittance, when they're given a $900 million contract, a $800 million contract, they are all from one ethnic group. And one has to understand that Guyana, though we talk about private enterprise, it's a state-dominated society in which most of the resources are allocated by the state. And so there is no civil society that is independent. You have a state-controlled, totalitarian type society. We have had cases in Guyana where the government took away sponsorship from a newspaper, and the newspaper in trouble and have to toe the line because they use that power and wealth at their disposal to manipulate the system and ensure that they instill fear, create these barriers, so in the final analysis, they hope to prevail.
Oh my goodness.
Should I also point out that, like Dominica, after the last election, every observer group said that we should not go to elections without rectifying the voters list.
Wow, you're talking when you say observer group, because sometimes
international observers,
international, because somebody might say,
If you go to the
Current,
CARICOM report, it says that. If you go to the Carter Center report, it says that. If you go to the European report, every one of the reports bemoan the fact that the list is a problem. And the government knows the list is a problem. Let me tell you why. The government did a census since 2023, and they are refusing to release the census. In fact, our information is that they tried instructing the Stats Bureau to make changes, and they didn't do it. So what you have is the government holding on to the census, and the people of Guyana still operating, I think, by the 2001 census that says 750,000 people. Now, the rate of migration in Guyana is very high, from Guyana is very high. And we think that a lot of Guyanese would have left since then, but the government refuses to release the census. So no one knows what is the actual population in Guyana.
Voting of the voting population. What's the percentage that vote in Guyana? I'm forgetting the term that is used. Yes, go right ahead. The voter turnout. The voter turnout. Thank you.
Before I actually touch the question, I want to give my colleague from Dominica some advice. We have a similar situation, but from the time I became lead in 2021, I've been saying to the Guyanese people, take the money and vote what you believe is right. Vote for us. And if you carry such a campaign, it might help. I do agree with you. This government does it as well. They ensure people stay in poverty, so they become dependent, and therefore they can manipulate. But let me now go to the question of the problem is deeper than electoral reform. One of the problems is political culture. We come out of a history of domination. We got independence, but the culture of domination continues. We have not developed a culture of finding compromise and consensus. So while constitutional reform will help, if there isn't the attitudinal metamorphosis, if there isn't the change in the political culture, there'll be problems. Now, I think Sir Arthur Lewis, in one of his books on West Africa, gave us the solution a while back, but it is not easy to get it in this part of the world. He virtually said, every decision that affects a section of the society, that section of the society should have a say in it. Now, we inherited a Westminster system, which is premised on some assumptions out of England that do not exist in the Caribbean. We, for instance, there ain't gonna be any big debate over the budget. The government brings the budget, they put it and they pass it just like that. Now, if you do the reform and you could bring what is called weighted voting, Professor might know about weighted voting in consociational systems, in which, as opposed to passing the budget with 51%, you have to pass it with, say, 60 or 2/3. What that means is that government is compelled to engage opposition to get a budget that reflects the society. Unfortunately, the downside of that is that it can produce gridlock. But there has to be some amount of constitutional reform to ensure that the resources in the society are allocated in a much fairer way.
Okay.
You can change all the laws. If the country continues to be a country in which by a one-seat majority, like we always get in recent times, they can exclude sections of the society, then you will have the same problems. Because in post-colonial states like Guyana and those in the Caribbean, one of the most important definitions of politics is the authoritative allocation of resources, in which the state has the authority to allocate the resource. And if the state can do it with a simple majority, it is not obligated to allocate resources so it is fair across the country. And that's one of the big problems in Guyana. How do we change the law to ensure that all sections of the society can benefit equally from the state allocation of resources? And so a lot of times when people talk constitutional reform, they look at the legal corpus, but fail to look at the economic basis. And in large measure, a lot of things that happen in the political base are determined by the economic decisions you make.
Yes.
One of the reasons people seek to clutch on and stay in power is because as government, you have the authority to allocate resources, and you allocate it how you feel. If there is a change in the system to result in a much more equitable economic distribution, then you have the basis for a state that is fair. Now, in Guyana's context, at the institutional level, they have compromised every institution that is supposed to be independent. Be it the Guyana Police Force, the Public Service Commission, on our Teacher Service Commission. I oppose the government putting two people that are known PPP activists, and therefore they have no basis to be objective. And so a lot of the decisions that are made by the commissions in Guyana are made in keeping with the diktat of the government. And so these institutions that are supposed to be a counterbalance to executive power are now brought in line with executive power and actually carrying out the mandates. We just had this case of Adriana Young.
Yes, and our condolences, please. We did that we are sending our condolences to you and the entire Guyana. We showed some pictures at the beginning of the show.
Thanks. But let me say this. I want to raise this case. Here is a simple case of the reporting of a missing child. And rather than the Guyana Police Force investigate, they began to protect those who were accused of the crime. And in a matter as dangerous as this, they hold the person for a short period and then lose them. And so you do not have a police force that is operating to enforce law and order. We have a case where a person is now going to run, a man named Mohammed, who was close to the PPP, would have fallen out with the PPP. And what happened? Before, the police were saying they had no information, the evidence didn't point in this direction. Now, I'm not saying the man is guilty or not. But now that the man declares he's going to be a candidate in the election, the government is now saying they have information to charge him.
Wow.
Now, in any democratic sane society, the president and the vice president should have been facing the full force of the law, because it means that you had information, you knew of the crime, you were complicit in the crime, and only when the person is a challenge to you, you now decide you are going to prosecute them. And so when you look at the Adriana Young case, you see a clear situation where the government, the police, they were protecting the person who this allegation was against. And this is most interesting. There were two previous allegations of the same kind. And you would see the commander in the area providing false information saying this child left the hotel in a red Ram vehicle. Couldn't produce any videos. And the police then come to say, oh, they were misinformed.
Now you are the person in charge of these CCTV cameras. And I'm telling you this to make another point just now. You're in
Yes,
charge of
because,
these
yeah.
CCTV cameras, and you give this false information. So that even if you do the constitutional reform, you have to reform the entire Guyana police force. We have had too many cases where there are cameras and the evidence should be easy to collect, and the police fails to collect it. But any petty crime undertaken by common people, these cameras
Wow.
work. And you're going
All
to
of a
pick up
sudden,
a little
all of a sudden they
pickpocket.
work. All
But
of a sudden.
murderers, high-end criminals, these cameras don't work. The point I make in here is that even if you have constitutional reform, but you don't have the independence and quality services like the police service, then you still will be in the same place, because corruption has caused Guyana to become a place where there is no rule of law. And when there is the rule of law, is the rule of law for the rich at the expense of the poor.
Of Guyana. You weren't finished speaking about that, but I saw you wrote down something about campaign reform, campaign financing. So you're on the floor, sir.
All I was going to say is that we have the same thing here. It takes different forms. For instance, they will give contracts. And when they give contracts, a percentage goes to the government. Of course, some goes into private pockets. So the government is always well equipped with money to run a campaign. I must tell you, we had Barnaby last year.
Wow.
There is what I call a kind of psychological warfare on the African Guyanese youth, where they bring these artists. And I have no problem with artists in themselves. But when you feed a people a culture of that kind of entertainment all year round, what you're doing is eroding, first of all, your culture, because you're not having these cultural performances that reflect your culture.
Yes.
And you are also pointing your youth out to the country. You are also pointing your youth to some of the most lawless music around. And mind you, I'm a lover of reggae music. I'm a lover of all music. But if you promote certain artists, then in that process, what you are doing is promoting a culture that might not necessarily be in the best interest of our society. And so I don't see them bringing them as only for political purposes. It is also an attempt to control psychologically the mind of young people, remove from them the ambition and the stick-to-itness that is needed for them to pursue professional and other careers. Look, the people who bring the artists make money on it, and I have no problem with that. But we also, as a society, we have to ensure that the artists we bring do not contribute to a moral degeneration. And a lot of times, that seems to be the focus. And when you are in an ethnically divided society like Guyana is, and you do that with the African Guyanese community, you are also generating problems and possibly putting people in psychological slavery in some regard. So one has to see it in context. The coming of an artist is not an issue. It is the type of artist you bring, what you are promoting in the society, and those are the things that matter. So I would say to you, I see no harm in artists visiting, but I see a problem when you select the worst of artists, the worst of music, and you make that the normal diet in the society. As it relates to campaign financing, not under this government in Guyana. They don't like rules. Look, this government doesn't like rules and regulation at all. Let me give you one.
That sounds like the motley. It sounds like you're describing the motley government.
Let me say this to you. we had, since 1957 or 61, I don't remember which one directly, a public accounts committee that scrutinizes the spending of government. You know what I'm telling you? The rule was any 3 members of the public accounts committee could scrutinize the accounts. So I think the government has either 5 or 4, and the opposition got 3. Now, the government went to the parliament the day I was sworn in. It's the first bill I spoke against. And they changed the rule to say for there to be a quorum of the public accounts committee, it will no longer be any 3 person. It must be 2 from the government, 2 from the opposition, and the chairman. And the government has not been turning up. And
Right.
because they are not turning up, we are still auditing the accounts of the previous 2015 to 2020. So they have emasculated the Public Accounts Committee. They have removed from it its potency. In fact, right now, it is not scrutinizing public accounts. It is operating at the whims, fancies, and caprices of the government. And therefore, it cannot be a government, a public accounts committee that seeks to hold the government accountable. And mind you, remember I was talking about weighted majority?
Yes.
They changed that with a 1-seat majority. If you had a proper system, then that would not have happened. And so the absence of, the presence of a bad political culture, the absence of checks and balances, the desire of the government to dominate and control have all resulted in the virtual non-existence of democracy and a democratic culture. And that's where we are here in Guyana.
To Mr. Norton. Go ahead, Mr. Norton.
I think Professor Peter Jamadar, I think was his name, years ago, since I was lecturing at the university, pointed out that the Caribbean have what he called cabinet dictatorships. And I think we didn't pay attention to it. But there is the cabinet dictatorship. And I think we have got to, as we look at constitutional reform, find ways and means of diffusing the power so that it could be in other points rather than just in the cabinet that governs the country. I wanted to make that point.
Yes, because that's actually you segue into what I was going to ask. I was going to ask: is democracy in the Caribbean truly at risk? And I'm asking, based on what we've heard tonight, and though we didn't have a full analysis of Barbados, those of us who are listening, we don't have to be the leader of the opposition or a political candidate or political leader to understand what is happening in Barbados politically at this moment. And so I have to ask the question: is democracy in the Caribbean truly at risk? Mr. Norton, continue, please. Is it really at risk?
You see, we make the assumption that at some stage we achieved democracy. We never did. As I understand,
you said we never did achieve democracy.
No, I think democracy is a process. And many countries begin that process. And in that process, there are always setbacks. Some setbacks are more than some. And so you end up being kind of dictatorial. But if one thinks about, say, the minute I hear somebody say, Guyana is a democracy, Trinidad is a democracy, my position would be, Guyana, Trinidad aspire to democracy. But when you look at the happenings in the society, you recognize democracy is not an event, it's a process. And in that process, it demands a high level of political consciousness. It demands a high level of political responsiveness so that when it is seen and it is going in the wrong direction, the society needs to be politically conscious enough to rally against the dictatorial elements that are emerging in the democratic process. And unless the society arrives at that level of political consciousness and understand that protest is critical to achieving democratic objectives, then we will be lost. For us to call any one of these societies democratic is a misnomer. We are guided by constitutions that should allow us to be democratic. But there is a contradiction between the theoretical ambit of the constitution and the practical reality. And mind you, it is easy to kill a man in the name of democracy. But then, democracy says you shouldn't take a man's life without it as part of the law. You can defend virtually anything.
Anything.
And mind you, another mistake people make is to assume that the law is always right. And if a society is going to emerge as a democratic society, there has to be regular constitutional change to remove the problems. Don't forget, it was the rule of law in South Africa for Black people to be treated the way they were treated because it was in the Constitution. But not because it is in the Constitution, it is right. It might be legal. It might be legal. So we have to run on two parallel paths. One of abiding by the Constitution, but two, constant review to ensure that the Constitution is in step with reality, honesty, morality, and a number of other things that should guide a democratic system.
But we have a regional electoral oversight body. I don't know if it already exists under CARICOM.
I believe they could be, but unless it comes with clear rules, you can have a regional oversight body, and the wealthy and powerful get to them, and the oversight is still skewed in the direction of the rich. The problem we have, first, elections must reflect the will of the people. And to the extent that our elections don't reflect the will of the people, they are really not democratic. Then once it reflects the will of the people, there should be good governance and the involvement of the people. You see, there's a difference between government and governance. Mm-hmm. Government is the apparatus. Governance is how you do it. And a lot of times, it isn't done in keeping with law. It isn't done in keeping with democratic processes. And a lot of time, government moves in the direction of centralizing power rather than devolving power on more institutions. For instance, local government is intended to become a tier of government in which the people in the community make the decision. But then central government tends to intervene to impede that. And so, even though it is intended to bring people in decision making, it ends up becoming another layer of government that is controlled by central government. The big problem is every politician speaks to democracy, etc. But then when he or she hits power, the reality of power comes. And I believe there is one other issue that causes politicians to behave how they behave. When they get wealthy at the expense of the people, they have to worry when they are out of government. Mm-hmm. And that, to me, unless we can, I've always said all across Guyana, one of the things I'm happy about is that I cannot be accused of corruption. I've kept clean hands. I believe the minute you start to become corrupt, you will have to start to hold on to power at all costs.
Yeah, ready to do that. The numbers on the screen. If you're overseas, you can add the number as a WhatsApp number and call us via WhatsApp. Okay, go ahead, Mr. Norton.
I was about to say I wouldn't agree with it being controlled by CARICOM. You
Okay.
know, we have to recognize that those who are at CARICOM are at the whims, fancies, and caprices of the government
Mhm.
that finance them. So they start by not being independent. And then when you move to CARICOM heads, there is a certain solidarity among them when they're in power.
Mhm.
And they are not likely to go against one of their colleagues, except for strange reasons. And
Mhm.
so one has to recognize that the power dynamics also play out in international organizations. And that, like local organizations, though the intention is that international organizations be independent, they aren't. A
Mhm.
lot of times they depend on the state for the financing. They have to live good with the heads of state or heads of
Yeah.
government. And so that independence is almost automatically out the window. And that is why they will come to a place like Guyana, see a recount, see so many boxes with out documentation and all the things that we saw in that last recount, but still conclude that they're certifying the elections. Look, I give
Wow.
people an I give people an example. When I was General Secretary of the PNC, after the protests of 1997-98, we invited a Caribbean team to review the election results, etc. And they did. And when they produced the report, on behalf of my party, I took the report and I went through it with a fine teeth comb. And when I went through it, it didn't account for 70,000 votes. And rather than them saying that the elections were free and fair, or not free and fair, they sent an addendum that cater for the 70,000 votes.
Mhm.
So here is it. You claim to have done a
Wow.
forensic audit. We point out to you this is short, and you send an appendix or an addendum that merely says it was catered for but left out. That
Mhm.
says to you that in this regard, heads of state tend to, while they are in government, be comfortable and happy with those they know in government. And that
Mhm.
also generates problems.
Yeah. Wow.
I agree in large measure. In fact, in one of my academic articles, while I lectured at the University of Guyana, I said in it that civil society is either weak or non existent. Now, the concept of civil society, especially the one advocated by Putnam, the Italian political scientist, presupposes that there is an independence, that these people act in their own interests and independent. Unfortunately, again, the state is the major allocator of resources. A lot of
Mhm.
the private sector institutions don't have the kind of resources to sustain viable civil society organizations. And in case where they have the capacity, they are afraid of governments.
Mm.
So what has happened is that civil society has in the Ghana particularly is either weak or non-existent, and the role they should play as independent actors in the political system, they cannot play it because they are dependent on the political system for their own existence. And here again, I like to point out that he who controls the economics of the society in a small societies like ours are likely to control civil society, and they will not have the kind of independence to be able to take positions that allow them to be watchdogs of democracy.
It's to instill fear in the community, fear in the society. So
In
we,
Guyana's
yeah.
in Guyana's case is not only fear, um, it's political harassment.
Hmm.
You're talking about people reporting. The criminal investigation department in this country and other areas have people just to monitor those programs. And by the time somebody says anything that they perceive to be out of line, the police is in front of your home.
Mr.
And so,
Mr. Norton, I wanted to say that. Hold a minute. I am serious about this. Barbadians, you don't even know what you're saying right now, what the two of you have done tonight. Because the cybercrime bill, sir, was supposed to do that. And we were telling them this show would be in trouble if that cybercrime bill comes in effect. They would be at my door to take me to jail, or anybody who comes on this. So could you say that again? You have that cybercrime bill in
well,
Guyana. So tell them what happened.
I'm telling you from experience, and I should say the cybercrime bill that we have was passed while we were in government, but it was never used in the way it is being used. Its intention was to protect the state and so against cybercrime. What this government has done is transform it into a tool of repression of the people of Guyana. And so what I was saying to you is that if you make a comment, nobody has to report you. This criminal investigation department here has people monitoring, other agencies monitoring. And by the time you finish making the statement, you will be in the lockups in Georgetown. And mind you, they are losing most of the cases, but they also uses it as a tool of political harassment. If they have you going to court regularly and you have to report to the police, they harass you to the point where you decide you don't want to be an activist anymore. That's the reality of Guyana.
Proceeds to work in the best interest of the public.
Yes. Wow. Mr. Norton.
I agree with the speaker. I wouldn't say all politicians. I'd say most politicians don't outline a vision. I can say for me as opposition leader, one of the first things I did when I became opposition leader was to outline our vision for Guyana, which we call a people-centered development vision, in which we say, essentially, we will put the people of Guyana first, and rather than ensuring resources go to the families and friends of the government and the elite, we want to see it in the hands of the people. And so we have outlined a vision. But the problem is more than that. The political system in Guyana and in the Caribbean doesn't cater for post-election. Let me tell you what I mean. You mobilize all and sundry for election. Once the elections are over, you start demobilizing when you should be continuously remobilizing to execute your vision. And so what happens is people are well mobilized and motivated for elections. And when you start to demobilize them, they lose contact with the vision you put out. They lose contact with the plan. And they go into dormancy till the next election. And so you do not have a buy-in of the people in the development process. And so they end up feeling alienated by the very system of governance we have in the Caribbean. I would advocate for Caribbean leaders that, yes, elections be used as a means of mobilizing people in support of your plan, but we need to now look at the post-election period to set up mechanisms to ensure the engagement and continuous mobilization so that it can be the execution and your plan and your vision involving the people. And so this dynamic of mobilization, demobilization has to be solved if we're going to move forward in a profound way.
About
all I would say, I'm well disposed to be on the program. And once I give you my word, I'm coming. I'm going to come.
Thank you for that.